And to finalize today's class, I would like to describe or walk you through some highlights about ethical data science, a basic understanding about different questions that you have to ask yourself when you are working on data science projects to make sure that you are following minimal ethical guidelines. And so, as a starting point, I would like you to reflect on some of the data sets that we have used in today's class. So, for example, we've been talking about the Pima Indians data set that basically has different types of health-related and socioeconomic characteristics of female Pima Indians in order to be able to predict whether they will suffer from diabetes or not. I also talked about the Swiss dataset, which is basically a dataset that has information from Swiss women, and it tries to predict fertility from a set of various socioeconomic data variables. We've also talked about the Boston dataset. I never described specifically one column that it's in the data frame, which is called black, but it's not the percentage of Black population. It's a very specific computation around race that I would like to discuss as well. And so when you think about these data sets, you have to ask yourselves, how were these data sets collected, right? I mean, were the people part of these data sets aware of how the data was going to be used or was going to be distributed, right? These data sets now, they are accessible to all researchers through our packages, in other software tools as well, like scikit-learn, like TensorFlow. And so, when you use these data sets, you also have to understand, again, questions like how were the data collected, were the individuals aware of how the data was going to be used, beyond the data itself, data collection itself, how are some of the variables that we are using computed if they are not a metric that was directly measured from the participants, what are the types of manipulations that we are doing to the data, right? And so today I want to briefly talk about three different elements of ethical data science or doing data science ethically. Some of the questions that I will discuss are questions around mostly food for thought for you around data collection practices, around data and variable manipulation practices, and finally about the models that we use and how we evaluate how good a model is, model evaluation. In the area of data collection, to make sure that the data sets that we use have been ethically collected, we would have to ask ourselves things like, for example, whether permission was requested, right? When the data set was collected, did participants know that their data was going to be collected for research purposes? Did they know that their data was going to be reused, that could be distributed, across many software platforms that are being used by millions of software engineers and researchers? Beyond requesting permission, oftentimes researchers, we use IRBs, which are sort of formal documents that we need participants to sign to be, for them to be aware of the different things that we're going to be doing with them as participants and of how, for example, their data is going to be handled. But oftentimes participants, although it's called informed consent, oftentimes participants, because sometimes we use technical terms, don't fully or might not fully understand all the details of the IRBs they are signing, right? And so one thing is signing and giving your consent, and something very different is whether you fully understood all the things that you were signing for. Other issues around ethical data collection that researchers working with data sets and in data science need to consider are things like, for example, privacy. Okay, so once your participants have, for example, agreed for the data to be collected and they have agreed for the data to be, for example, distributed, can you as a researcher make sure that the data is fully anonymized or pseudonymized, okay, in a way that no researcher will be able to take that data set and identify a single individual in that data? And there's different methods to do this, but as a researcher and as an ethical data collection approach, this should be warranted as well as part of the data set. Oftentimes, it's also important to make sure that the datasets that we collect as researchers fairly represent the populations that we're modeling. For example, imagine that you want to build a model that will predict COVID-19 cases, but your model does not have any information from Latino communities. So chances are that your prediction, the prediction of COVID-19 cases for Latino communities won't work very well, right? And so it's really important that whenever we are collecting data, we collect it ethically, but we also collect it from all the communities that might be impacted by the models that we build. And then finally, I would also like you to think a little bit more about, how the data sets have been generated. So sometimes it's just, participants providing data by, for example, filling out a survey. But other times, if you think about, for example, how content moderation is done on different social media platforms, you have individuals that have to go through the content, through videos, through texts, and evaluate whether something, for example, requires of content moderation or not, or has to be eliminated from the platform or not. And those individuals not only work under very stressful settings, because watching and reading all of these extremely negative messages might have an impact on their health, but also oftentimes many of those communities that work on labeling are also very badly paid, and are part of sort of the cheap labor wave in labeling data sets. And so that also needs to push us to think, if we are using certain data sets, or if we are planning on collecting a data set, on making sure that the data set or the labels that we have in the data set are not, as much as possible, not built on free labor or cheap labor. Beyond ethical data collection, it's also important to understand, whenever we work with data sets, the variable manipulations that have been made to those data sets. Most of the times, I have to say, the data sets that we use generally have features that have been directly collected from participants, or from surveys, or from interviews. But sometimes some of those variables are manipulated and do not exactly represent like one feature from a survey. For example, I want to walk you through this example of that's part of the Boston dataset that we have used. And basically, in that data set, remember that the objective is predict the median cost of a house in Boston, and we have different variables in there and that we have already discussed many times. But one of the variables that we've never discussed, I mean, we've mentioned number of rooms or crime in the neighborhood, but one of the variables that we have never discussed that it's also there, it's a column called black. And it does not represent the proportion of Black residents, or it does, but it does in a way that has sort of a specific perception of the relationship between population and prices embedded in how that variable is computed. If you look at that data set, the Black column is actually computed as 1,000 multiplied by the percentage of Black population minus 0.63 to the square root. Okay? And what this is not just, again, the proportion of Black residents, but rather it's a parabolic relationship between the proportion of Black individuals and house prices. So exactly what that plot looks like is like something like this, right? And so what this Black variable is saying is that the larger the Black population we have in a neighborhood, the lower the house prices are going to be. And exactly it's determining that that relationship is going to happen with a parabolic shape, okay? It's up to you to question whether that's the right approach to represent the relationship between prices and Black population. I would highly recommend that rather than using any type of embedded idea that you might have in your mind, you just input their percentages of races for Black, for white, for Latino, for Asian, for American Indian, for all the different populations present in the US. You embed those in your model and try to understand what's the role of race in housing prices, right? I think that this is a wrong approach to embed data, because you are not embedding a percentage to understand the relationship, but rather you are embedding a specific type of relationship between that variable and the variable that you want to predict. Okay, and then the third thing in terms of ethical data science that I would like you to think about is also about the implications of the models you create, right? And this is very related to what we call fairness of the models that we create. Think about, for example, the different face recognition systems that were developed, and that after the development, this was around like 5 or 6 years ago, researchers started to describe that those systems didn't work well for dark faces. Like they would not recognize black faces as well as lighter skin faces, and this is mostly due to the fact that the way the data was collected to test these systems was not representative of the population at large, right? And so this brings us again back to ethical data collection practices. When we are collecting data, the data needs to be representative of whomever is going to be, affected by the model that you are training. And so again, it's very important that when you train whatever model you train, you make sure that the data that you are using is the data that you need to train that model, right? And so, for example, this is, as I was saying before, it's related to what we call fairness in models. And fairness can be measured in many different ways, but one dimension that we can use to model fairness is accuracy, or make sure that all races and ethnicities have exactly the same accuracy in your model, right? In other words, your model doesn't work better or worse for specific races or ethnicities, or, for example, for specific age groups. Like you don't want to develop a system that can predict diabetes really well for young people, but not for elder people, because, for example, you didn't have enough data from elder people in your model. Okay, and so again, this is another important element to take into account when you are working on data science projects, how well your model works for different types of social determinants, so that, whenever your model is used for a specific population, we can know that the model will work equally well. And so basically, to sum up, when you work on data science projects, you really want to make sure that you are following important ethical guidelines that will guarantee that the models and the research questions and the data sets that you're using will not have any negative impact on the population. And so always remember to think about the provenance of the data sets, like how were those data sets collected, was there informed consent, is privacy an important element in how the data was aggregated, are we collecting data from everybody that might be affected by the data science project that you are running. Think also at the variables you create and you use. Make sure that the variables are as closer as possible to the raw data that was originally collected from a survey or from elsewhere, right? And try to avoid doing any type of transformations that might have an ideology or a specific idea that you want to test within the variable itself. Shift your idea testing to the model. And obviously, the third component, as I've already mentioned, think about the implications of the research questions that you want to answer and of the models that you're using to answer those questions. Think whether the model is appropriately working or similarly working across different social determinants, and think whether the questions that you are asking can be answered with the data that you have, because sometimes the answer is that you cannot answer that research question with that data, and so you would need to collect new data or just, pick a completely different research question.